Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Doug Allen. I'm a professor in the Daniels College of Business at the University of Denver. And it's my pleasure to try to figure out how to describe what is one of the largest projects in history in only 20 minutes. But we're going to give it a try. And hopefully the objective here is to give you a very broad overview and perhaps to whet your appetite sufficiently that you'll want to go into more depth and learn more as we move forward. So the Belt Road project that has been initiated by China is basically an attempt to recreate the Silk Road trading routes. And the Belt refers to a land network of railroads and overland transportation systems. The road actually refers to a maritime complex of shipping routes that, well, as you can see here, initiate in China, but transcend not only Asia, Middle East, and end up even in the western parts of Europe, including the UK. That was much of the traditional Silk Road trading route, but in this iteration, it also includes parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, and in some descriptions, even Latin America. So it's a massive and very, very ambitious project that has been described in very superlative terms by a number of onlookers. For instance, when you say, how big? Well, a guy named Bremer says it's the century's most ambitious geopolitical venture to date. China's president, Xi, says it's the project of the century. Bloomberg Businessweek calls it a pharaonic scheme. In other words, one worthy of the pharaohs of the past, a titanic project. And Time magazine referred to it recently as a leviathan. So these are the kinds of words that are being used to describe the Belt Road project, and consulting agencies, research agencies have developed their own handbooks and guides to this new Belt Road system. Businessweek describes it simply as China's great leap outward. So, a question would be, why is this being initiated? China is interested in creating this network of trade that allows them to access these different markets and these markets to access China, as well as to trade within the system using the infrastructure that's been created. Some academics and policy analysts are debating, is it mostly political? Is it mostly economic? Is it mostly developmental? And the answer is obviously yes. It's all of the above. And so to look at a few of those things very briefly, some political motivations. Certainly it is an opportunity for China to extend its global reach, to shape global trade in meaningful and new ways. Some people say if the project is achieved, the trade will not look the same anywhere in the world, that it will affect the entire global trading system. It's consistent with China's Go West policy, which has, over the last 10 to 15 years, strongly emphasized developing the western provinces of China and actually moving beyond to the west, to various parts of Asia and Europe. It, of course, builds on China's success in Africa. You may know that China has been very aggressive in investing in Africa, perhaps as much as $200 billion of infrastructure and other investments already undertaken. In the last 10 years, 1 million Chinese have emigrated to Africa, which means that in the last 10 years, more Chinese have moved to Africa than did the Europeans over the entire 400 years of the colonial period. It's an amazing thing to think about. Africa came up earlier today in our conversation. I would say it's a topic that should be at the forefront of future World Trade Days as we're moving forward. Here's one observer from venture capital journal saying, "One Belt, One Road aims to recast 2 continents worth of disconnected developing markets as a global economic nucleus. It is a geopolitical watershed with deep and complex investment potential." Of course, there are also economic motivations, and in fact, the design is primarily an economic design. access to new markets, outlet for China's overcapacity. China's overcapacity for steel equals the total capacity of the next 4 steel producers combined: United States, Russia, India, and Japan. And just imagine that. That's the overcapacity in China. Infrastructural contracts for Chinese companies that have honed their skills in the vast China market and are now looking for new opportunities overseas. A vehicle for promoting China's own IP as their technology is implemented in these projects: railway systems, telecom, and other types of things. It is expected in the first 10 years to increase China's trade with the Belt Road countries by over $2 trillion. And the bottom line is make it easier for China to trade with the world. Of course, there are development motivations also. This project is intended to improve connectivity between the Belt Road countries themselves. It alleviates Asia's estimated $26 trillion infrastructural deficit, and of course it contributes to global relationship building on many fronts. China's initiated several different investment vehicles that can help funnel investment dollars into these projects. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, that some see as an alternative to the World Bank and the IMF, is in place, as is the Silk Road Fund and a number of institutions within China itself. So let's go back to that question: how big? We saw the superlatives, but let's look at some numbers. It involves 65 so-called roadside countries. In those countries reside 2/3 of the world's population, generating about 40% of the GDP globally. 75% of known energy reserves are in this area. 5 to 8 trillion is the total anticipated investment over a period of about 30 to 50 years, and 19 satellites are intended to be placed into Earth orbit to support just the GPS needs of the projects in this area. At least 2 are already up and running. As I said, 30 to 50-year project. How does this compare to the Marshall Plan? Well, depending on what kind of estimate we end up with, in reality, it could be as large as 35 to 50 U.S. Marshall Plans in terms of taking Marshall Plan in current dollars and comparing it to the current dollars anticipated invested in this project. There's also just the inkling of a discussion about one belt, one road, one circle, meaning that China might begin investigating polar trade routes as well. The scale of China's Belt and Road Initiative, according to Rajiv Biswas, could eclipse the role of the G7 or G20 forums as a new framework for stimulating infrastructure development in low-income developing countries. By 2030, it's estimated that 2/3 of the middle-class consumers will be in Asia. Craig was talking about that in his discussion earlier today, and this chart shows how that will shift from 2000 to 2050. The blue and the green are middle-income consumers in North America and Europe. The red is Asia. I think the understated area, that orange, is Africa. That will probably be a bigger share than they're projecting in that chart there. Of course, there are concerns. It's an emergent concept with a lot of ambiguity. It's huge. There are security problems in many of the Belt Road countries that need to be addressed. There's a question about whether the heavy involvement of China's state-owned enterprises will result in one belt, one trap instead of one belt, one road, because many of these companies will perhaps be driven by other than market kinds of considerations as projects are taken on, possibly exploitive in nature. Is it a symmetrical relationship between China and the Belt Road countries? Is it too ambitious? On the other hand, could it actually tilt the global economic power towards China? Companies are beginning to take a look at this with very hungry eyes, and you can just kind of scan down this list to see some of the economic opportunities that companies have identified. This is from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Just to give you one example, in terms of equipment export, General Electric exported more than $2 billion of equipment to Belt Road projects in 2016. as one company's experience. So here it is. This is what we've been talking about. The expansive nature is probably unprecedented in the history of the world. And the question is, will it actually happen? Can China pull it off? That remains to be seen, but I think there is good indication that it has legs. I would point out that China is comfortable with the planned market economy and the public-private partnerships that go along with it, which is very much anticipated to be what this is all about. China knows how to scale, and they know how to scale fast. And China does infrastructure really, really well. Those 3 points lead us to the likelihood that China has the capacity and the capability to do this. I'll just show you a few examples from China's own experience within their own country. This is the current 5-year plan, and just look at the infrastructure components of it. Over 50 new airports to be built over the next 5 years, as well as a continuation of the development of the high-speed rail, 30,000 kilometers of highway either built or upgraded over the next 5 years. These are massive infrastructural projects in and of themselves. They continue on a tradition that has been observed in the world for some time. If we go back about 15 or 20 years, this is the Three Gorges Dam under construction, $75 billion project, equivalent to 15 DIAs in terms of its budget. Just a massive, massive project. Sometimes this clicker is not working here. Here are my students looking across at some of the construction. That's one of the hydro intake holes just on the very corner of the dam. And if you zoom in there, you can see people standing in those holes, just to give you some sense of the size. So infrastructure is something that China is very familiar with. Scale, this was the China World Expo in 2010. It attracted 70 million people in 6 months. That's roughly 7 times the comparable number that Disney attracted to the Magic Kingdom in the same period of time. So that kind of scale is also not new to China. If we go back in history a little bit further, another infrastructural project. This one, 6,000 kilometers long, about 3,000 miles long, 250 years to complete. If we were to undertake a project like that in the United States, a comparable example would be George Washington deciding to put a wall between Canada and the United States from coast to coast along the border. That would be about the length of the wall, and it would still be under construction because we haven't been a country for 250 years yet. Cities in China are the size, GDP-wise, of countries. You see Shanghai and Switzerland about the same level of GDP, just as an example of what's going on. And that beautiful thing that I went right past is right over here. That's Pudong. That's about the size of downtown Chicago. Here's the rest of Shanghai. Let's see, sometimes this is not responding here. Move to clicker number 2. Thank you. Just the green one? Okay. Still not working. Oh, there we go. Okay, another example is China will build a New York City a year for the next 10 years to accommodate the rural to urban migration that Craig again was talking about earlier today. That means that about the population of the United States will be moving from the rural to urban areas in the next 15 to 20 years. That will involve, in square feet, about 30 billion square feet of housing required. And of course, in addition to that, there will be upward mobility of the current urban residents as well. Infrastructurally, China has built out now what is the largest, not only the largest high-speed rail system in the world, but it's actually larger than the rest of the high-speed rail in the world. And all done in the last 10 years. About now about 20,000 kilometers, headed towards 30,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. If you look inside, pretty cushy arrangements inside. I didn't get to ride in this car, but I walked down to have a look at it. I was back in the cattle class, but even there, I had my own personal plug to recharge my laptop and my cell phone and such. Here is a third-tier city railroad station. This is Jinan, about halfway between Beijing and Shanghai. I was there in November. And notice this looks like an ultra-modern airport. And you see these railroad stations all over China supporting the build-out of the high-speed rail, complete with automated assistance to help customers with their ticketing and information needs. The same thing goes for the airline system in China. This is the International Departure Shack in Dalian, 1993. 2 months after I took this picture, this airport opened up. And this was the new airport in Dalian. I came back in 1996. They were complaining that this was outdated and too small for their needs. And so by 2000, a new terminal was built again to continue to accommodate the needs just of this one city of Dalian, sort of a secondary city in China, but a very beautiful city. I was able to go out and take these pictures because I was delayed for 12 hours by the snowstorm. And so, but notice what's over here on the side. Construction tarp. And if we go have a look, we'll find that another extension to the terminal was under construction at that time. In Beijing, the same story. You have a giant terminal now, but if you go back 25 years, it was a very small, old building that was built in the 40s and 50s. In 1999, that was totally replaced with a brand new terminal. 8 years later, in 2007, this was built, one of the largest covered spaces of any man-made object in the world. And this is not enough. 10 years later, this is under construction. This is the new airport south of Beijing that will open up next year, a few artist renditions of what it will look like inside. This is the speed with which infrastructure is changing in China, and Boeing likes it very much. This is Boeing headquarters in Beijing, and they say, their forecast is, and this is a little bit outdated now, they've actually increased their forecast, but roughly 1,700 commercial aircraft flying around in China today, the second largest commercial aircraft market in the world, soon to be #1, expected to triple in the next 20 years, and 100 greenfield or expansion airport projects planned or underway over the next 20 years. That's on top of about 300 new or expanded airports that were built between 1996 and 2016. If we go and look at some of the other developments, automation is a very big deal in China right now. The goal is to be the leader in automation by 2025, as you see there, or 2030. This was a robotics show in November. And many of the companies there were hanging their hat on the Belt Road project, saying, we are on board. We are leaving the station and we're heading west to be part of the Belt Road initiative. So, is OBOR going to happen? What do you think? We'll see. But what I would say is that it's already happening. As a matter of fact, as an example, last year, the first train left from Yiwu, China, bound for London, UK, and in January 2017, 7,500 miles. It arrived 18 days later compared to 40 to 50 days by ship. It was the 15th Belt Road country to be connected by rail with China. 34 containers were transported out, 88 back. Weekly service anticipated as we move forward. That's just one of many examples taking place. You can see here many free trade agreements already signed between China and Belt Road countries, and 15,000 Belt Road contracts signed as of August 27. Warren Buffett 2 weeks ago had his annual summit, and his take on the future of Sino-U.S. relations was this. He says the United States and China are going to be the two superpowers of the world, economically and in other ways, for a long, long, long time. It seems that it's worthwhile to take a look at some of these initiatives and figure out how we can participate as collaborators, not necessarily competitors. To wrap this up, I'd like to just share, if I can, a quote from the head of McKinsey consulting firm in worldwide consulting firm, but the head of McKinsey's Asia operations, as he's talking about the Belt Road. He says, While it's going to be very easy to provide long explanations of why this won't work, there are people already looking at what it's going to take to make it work. He says, at this stage, the very practical side of this is you could choose to sit out all of what we've just discussed. You could do so on the basis of this being a foreign policy move. The economics are questionable, the geographic coverage is never going to be achieved, the financial returns won't be offered. You could make all those assumptions and sit out. Or you could say, if I sit out, I may be missing out on the world's largest trading collaboration for many, many years, missing out on a set of theoretical opportunities that, if delivered, would amount to an enormous step change in infrastructure investment and the quality of trade. And you would say to yourself, do I really want to sit this out? Or is it time to at least understand at a deeper level and invest some time and assets in doing so? I hope this has been helpful in introducing the concept to you this morning. I'm happy to chat outside if you have questions that you'd like to raise, but my hope is that you'll investigate it further and see how there might be an opportunity in it for your own company and your own future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time here today. I think we have time for maybe 2 questions in here, if you would like to take them.
Okay, sure.
It occurred to me that as you were talking that we also were involved in a Pan-American highway at one time, and I don't even know the history of it, but is it at all similar in what was conceived as, I mean, my parents drove it except for a piece in Colombia, so tell us about the Pan-American highways,
well,
if it relates.
As a kid, I was a beneficiary of the Pan-American Highway. My mom and my 2 young brothers and I, when I was 12, my brothers were 11 and 6, I think, drove all the way from California to Oaxaca, Mexico, utilizing the Pan-American Highway. And it was a wonderful infrastructural development that really opened up Mexico and much of Latin America for trade as well as travel. I'd say that's a very mini example of what is anticipated in this Belt Road project. There are many more tendons and kind of things, tentacles and moving out. It's a much more comprehensive concept, partly benefiting from the fact that it's 60 or 70 years later and technologies are very different now than it was then. But it's the same concept. The Pan American Highway was intended and to a great extent achieved a tremendous integration of the various countries of the Americas.
The question was, can you tell us a little more about the financing of this project?
Yeah, I am not a financial expert, but the financing, I think, is absolutely coordinated through many of the Chinese financial institutions. So many of the export-oriented banks for China are involved in allocating funds for these projects, as well as the funds that I pointed out, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. There are opportunities for international entities to become involved and to invest in these projects through those funds, or to actually participate in some cases in the projects themselves, funded through these various kinds of agencies. But the expectation is that probably something on the order of 80% of the funding will be loans coming through various Chinese banks and entities.